The brickmaker who hid messages in clay, he was nameless, faceless, one of thousands, a brickmaker working under the scorching sun of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, nearly 4,000 years ago. Day after day, he dug clay from the riverbanks of the Euphrates, molded it by hand, stamped it with royal seals, and stacked it to dry in the burning heat. He was not a priest, not a scribe, not a nobleman, but somehow, across millennia, his voice has reached us. Because one day, as he shaped a brick destined for a palace wall, he did something extraordinary. He pressed a tiny message into the wet clay. Not for a king, not for the gods, but for someone, anyone, who might find it one day. A hidden complaint. The brickmaker wrote in cuneiform, the earliest known writing system, used by scribes and scholars of the time. But unlike most tablets filled with decrees, inventories, or prayers, this was different. Buried deep within the clay, out of sight, invisible once the brick was stacked, was a personal protest. And he wasn't alone. Archaeologists have since uncovered dozens of such secret messages hidden in bricks excavated from palace ruins, ziggurats, and temples across Mesopotamia. They weren't meant to be read by kings or preserved in museums. They were whispered cries pressed into clay by tired hands. Messages like, "The overseer shortens our rations. The foreman took my tools. We labor while they feast." These weren't dramatic declarations. They were desperate flickers of human truth, and they were never supposed to be found. Imagine the moment. A laborer kneeling in mud, surrounded by whip-cracking supervisors and the distant drone of priests. He glances over his shoulder. No one sees. He takes a stylus, maybe a sharpened reed, and presses it quickly into the soft clay. A phrase, a plea, a final act of resistance before the brick is stacked into the wall, sealed for eternity. And then, the centuries passed. The cities rose, fell, and turned to dust. The bricks remained, sun-baked and silent, until the 19th and 20th centuries, when teams of archaeologists unearthed the ruins of these ancient palaces and temples. At first, they cataloged the bricks like artifacts, examining royal stamps, weights, firing patterns. But then, some began noticing something else: faint markings, unofficial inscriptions, scribbled words hidden deep inside the bricks, on sides that would have faced inward, never meant to be seen. And when these were translated, the tone was unmistakable, personal, emotional, defiant. Suddenly, history shifted. It was no longer the story of kings alone, but of the workers, of men who had no power, no platform, yet somehow found a way to speak through time. These bricks became time capsules, not of glory, but of exhaustion, of anger, of longing. We read now of a man who was beaten for falling behind, of another who claimed his daily bread was stolen by a guard. One brick even held a prayer not to the gods of the temple, but to the brickmaker's dead wife. "I miss the warmth of your arms." Think about that. A message from a grieving man, hidden inside the very walls of a temple he likely could never worship in himself. His grief, baked into the structure, immortalized by fire and time. This was more than rebellion. It was survival. In a world where the poor were voiceless and the laborers invisible, these clay messages were a kind of quiet revolution, not loud enough to topple a kingdom, but strong enough to outlast it. When we think of ancient civilizations, we often picture kings in golden robes, armies on conquest, gods towering over their cities. But the people who built those cities, who shaped them brick by brick, are rarely given names, let alone voices. These hidden messages change that. They remind us that history isn't made only by those who ruled, but also by those who suffered beneath them, and found a way, even in silence, to be heard. A brickmaker had no pen, no audience, but he had clay, and he knew the fire would preserve what he dared to say. Thousands of years later, we are listening. And perhaps that's the most profound thing of all, that when every monument crumbles, when kings are forgotten, the quietest voice, pressed into mud, can still speak across the centuries. So next time you pass a brick wall, remember, it might hold a message, a secret, a soul, and somewhere deep inside, a voice still whispering, "I was here, I saw, I felt, I mattered." The pyramid workers who built a union. We've been told the story for centuries, that the pyramids of Egypt were built by slaves, whipped into submission, broken by stone, buried beneath the weight of the pharaoh's ambition. But history, as it often does, tells a far more human and far more rebellious tale. Because beneath the shadow of those eternal monuments, a union was formed. And the first known labor strike in recorded history wasn't born in factories or coal mines. It was born in the sands of Giza. Around 4,000 years ago, under the searing sun of ancient Egypt, thousands of workers were toiling to construct one of the most awe-inspiring architectural feats the world has ever known. These weren't slaves in chains. These were skilled laborers, stonecutters, masons, bakers, brewers, housed in organized workers' villages. They were paid in rations, bread, beer, onions, and occasionally meat. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough, until it wasn't. Something changed. Records from papyrus fragments and tomb graffiti reveal the tipping point. Delays in rations, spoiled food, days without meat, and then silence from the overseers. But the workers didn't suffer quietly. They organized. They protested. Not with weapons, but with symbols. Broken baskets, shattered tool handles, and empty food jars, placed publicly for all to see. It was a message carved not in stone, but in absence. One of the most well-documented strikes occurred at Deir el-Medina, a village of tomb workers in the Valley of the Kings, around 1152 BCE during the reign of Ramses III. These workers, responsible for crafting the resting places of pharaohs themselves, laid down their tools and refused to work. Not once, but multiple times. Their demands, rations they were owed, fair treatment, dignity. They blocked the road to the royal necropolis. They staged sit-ins at temples. They used the very infrastructure of the state to make themselves visible and impossible to ignore. And it worked. Officials, panicked by the disruption, quickly released delayed payments and restored food deliveries. But the workers didn't stop there. They had tasted something powerful. The idea that even in a land ruled by gods and kings, those who labored could push back. Ancient Egypt's bureaucracy was vast. Scribes documented everything: rainfall, grain tallies, and, yes, labor unrest. These weren't spontaneous riots. They were coordinated acts of resistance. Workers appointed spokesmen. They met in groups. They walked off in shifts. They staged what we might now call collective bargaining. And the state had to respond. Even more remarkable is how these laborers saw themselves. Not as expendable tools, but as critical players in the divine machine. They weren't just stacking stone. They were building eternity. The pyramids and tombs were sacred, and so was their work. And when they were mistreated, they knew it wasn't just a political insult. It was a cosmic imbalance, so they fought back. With broken basket handles held high like empty protest signs, they declared that without them, the afterlife itself might remain unfinished. Imagine the power of that moment. In a time where pharaohs were gods on earth, laborers still dared to say no. Not with violence, not with destruction, but with stillness, with the absence of labor, with the simple refusal to obey. In one of the most hierarchical societies in history, they dared to stand still and be heard. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of this solidarity in unexpected places. Graffiti scrawled on walls, jokes etched into tombstones, songs of complaint woven into workday routines. These weren't just builders. They were a community. And when the system failed them, they acted like one. They weren't trying to overthrow the pharaoh. They weren't demanding luxury. They were demanding fairness. Bread that wasn't moldy. Beer that wasn't watered down. Wages paid on time. It might seem small now, but in that world, where authority was absolute and order divine, it was revolutionary. Their actions would echo through time long before the word union existed, before labor laws, before strikes were protected or even imagined. These workers carved the blueprint for every future act of resistance in the workplace, not with chisels and stone, but with unity and silence. Today, when we look at the pyramids, we marvel at their scale, their symmetry, their impossible permanence. But hidden behind that wonder is a quieter legacy. The courage of the people who built them, not just with hands, but with voices, who didn't just move blocks, they moved power. And in the dust and ruins of their village, scattered among the jars and tools and fragments of their lives, are the earliest footprints of labor justice. Not slaves, not servants, but the first workers who dared to say, Enough. The mason who left an insult in stone. Cathedrals rise like frozen prayers across England. Great towers of stone, carved inch by calloused hands, meant to glorify God and kings. But look closely. Not at the stained glass, not at the saints. Look at the face of the king perched high above the cathedral entrance. His crown is perfect, his robes are regal, but his nose is crooked, slightly bent, imperfect, almost broken. This was no accident. In the shadows of medieval society, where speaking ill of royalty could cost you your life, one man chose a different path. He didn't write a pamphlet. He didn't start a rebellion. He simply picked up his chisel and told the truth in stone. The year was likely somewhere in the late 1200s or early 1300s. England was ruled by kings who claimed divine authority and demanded obedience. To insult a monarch, even in jest, was treason. But among the anonymous ranks of stonemasons building England's cathedrals, resentment brewed quietly. They were the invisible class. Laborers with astonishing skill, carving for hours in the cold, often unpaid or underfed. Their work would outlive them, but their names, forgotten. Except this one left his mark. On a cathedral facade, historians disagree whether it was Lincoln, York, or Wells. A series of regal figures was sculpted to represent monarchs or biblical kings. Each face noble, serene, untouched by hardship, except one. One statue bore a subtle deviation. A nose carved just off center, imperfect in symmetry. A quiet distortion so gentle it could be mistaken for erosion. But to a trained eye, and especially to a trained hand, it was deliberate. The question is why? Art historians believe this wasn't a mistake, nor an artistic interpretation. It was a message, a protest, a stonemason's secret insult, aimed directly at the ruling power that exploited him. A monarch made human, imperfect, fallible, not divine. In a time when kings built cathedrals to cement their legacy, one craftsman carved a crack into the illusion. He took the ultimate symbol of authority and made it flawed. He turned worship into commentary. This wasn't unique. Medieval cathedrals are filled with hidden resistance, grotesques that mock church officials, carvings of peasants mooning the nobles, faces with sly smiles tucked behind pillars. The only place a commoner could speak freely was in the margins of stone, because stone couldn't be censored. Kings might burn books, silence voices, or crush rebellion, but they rarely looked up. They never noticed the crooked nose staring down at them. The mason likely worked alone that day. He knew the risk. One wrong chisel, one overseer with sharp eyes, and he'd be jailed, or worse. But he also knew that stone endures, that long after the king turned to dust, this moment of truth would remain. He may have died in obscurity, but in one gesture, he became immortal. Today, thousands walk past the sculpture, unaware. Tour guides speak of architecture and style, but few mention rebellion, few point out the nose. But some notice, some look closer, and those who do begin to wonder. How many other secrets lie in these cathedrals? How many nameless hands carve their pain, their fury, their defiance into the walls of churches? In a world ruled by fear, one man found his voice in silence, a crooked nose, a chisel mark of courage, a whisper in stone, saying, "You are not perfect, and you are not untouchable." Stone remembers what the world forgets, and long after kings fall and names fade, the mason's truth remains, staring down from the heights with a defiant, broken smile. The workers who used beer as leverage. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It wasn't even bread. The currency that built the pyramids was beer. In the golden sands of ancient Egypt, under the relentless sun and gaze of pharaohs, workers labored, lifting stone blocks that weighed tons, hauling them with ropes, sweat, and sheer will. These were not slaves. They were skilled laborers, craftsmen, and stonemasons, hired by the state for royal projects, living in purpose-built villages near construction sites like Giza. And they were paid, not in coin, but in liquid bread, beer. It was more than a drink. It was survival. Made from emmer wheat and barley, thick and porridge-like, ancient Egyptian beer was packed with calories, nutrients, and water purified through fermentation. In a land where clean water could kill you, beer sustained life. It was breakfast. It was lunch. It was pay. Workers received daily rations, often as much as 4 liters per day. And it wasn't just a perk. It was an expectation, a contract, a right. So, when the beer stopped flowing, so did the work. One day, historians estimate around 1150 BCE, there was silence at the royal necropolis of Deir el-Medina. The chisels fell quiet. The hammers stopped ringing. And the workers, usually punctual and precise, did not show up. They were on strike. Why? Their beer rations had not arrived. Empty jugs were stacked in protest, symbols of absence. The message was clear. No beer, no labor. They marched. Not in chaos, but in order. They walked to the temples. They made demands, not just for beer, but for respect. They knew their value. They were building tombs for kings, carving prayers into stone, preserving legacies meant to last eternity. And yet, their stomachs growled, their throats burned, and the jugs were dry. The foreman tried to appease them. Promises were made, but the workers did not return until the rations did. It was, in the truest sense, one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in human history. And beer was their banner. Papyrus scrolls and ostraca, shards of pottery used for writing, have preserved the records. These weren't rebels. They were organized, literate, and proud. They protested not with violence, but with presence. They walked where they weren't supposed to walk. They entered sacred spaces. They made themselves impossible to ignore. And the state listened. Rations resumed. Beer flowed again. The tools returned to hand. And the great tombs continued to rise. But that moment, that refusal, echoed. It shattered a myth. For centuries, people believed that Egypt's pyramids were built by slaves under the lash. But archaeology and these protest records tell a different story. These were paid workers, protected by agreements, fed, housed, and trained. And when the system broke its promise, they stood up. And what they demanded wasn't luxury. It wasn't more gold or better housing. It was beer. Because in their world, beer was justice. Beer was dignity. Beer was the line between honor and abuse. To us, it may sound strange. How could fermented grain drive the gears of empire? But in the ancient world, it made perfect sense. Beer was stability. Beer was the rhythm of life. Even the gods were said to drink it. Hathor, the goddess of joy and fertility, was also the goddess of beer. And when the workers raised their voices, they weren't just asking for refreshment. They were demanding divine order be restored. In modern times, labor protests are often marked by picket lines and chants. In Egypt, it was rows of empty vessels, lined like soldiers, saying more than words ever could. And maybe that's why this story still matters, because it shows us that dignity is timeless, that across thousands of years, across deserts and dynasties, people have always known their worth. Even when building monuments to eternity, they pause to say, "We are human, and we will not be ignored." Beer may have built the pyramids, but courage kept them standing. And in the silence between hammer strikes, in the shadow of the pharaohs, the empty jugs whispered a truth the empire could not deny. The slave who faked a broken tool to escape. In the vast agricultural estates of ancient Rome, known as latifundia, the rhythm of daily life was set by the sound of chains, whips, and tools striking earth. These sprawling plantations fed the empire, producing grain, wine, and olive oil for Roman tables. But behind every harvest was a cruel truth. The fields were worked by slaves, and not all of them were willing to stay. Bound by violence and born into servitude, many Roman slaves knew their fate was sealed. Labor until death, or death for trying to escape. Surveillance was constant. Punishment was swift. And yet, some managed to disappear. How? They used their tools, the very instruments of their oppression, as weapons of deception. Archaeologists and historians studying Roman estates have uncovered a quiet pattern. Broken spades, shattered sickles, chipped plow blades, not from age or overuse, but from deliberate sabotage. Paired with accounts from ancient Roman writers like Columella and Varro, the evidence paints a hidden story. Slaves faking accidents to vanish. Imagine it. A young man, bones aching from days under the sun, lifts his iron hoe and brings it down. Not into the soil, but hard against stone. It snaps. He falls, clutching his hand, wincing in pain. His overseer curses and signals for someone else to carry him off. He's told to rest. Maybe for a day, maybe two. But by nightfall, he's gone. Into the trees, into the darkness, into the breath of freedom. If only for a while. The forests beyond the estate boundaries were dangerous, but for many, they were safer than the villa. Some escaped slaves joined latrones, bandit groups who roamed the countryside, robbing travelers and raiding farms. Others tried to reach cities, hoping to disappear into the slums of Rome or Naples. A few fled to the mountains, forming hidden communities where they might live as free men and women, always hunted, but always breathing. Roman landowners were well aware of these tricks. Manuals for estate management even warn against simulated injury and false tool breakage. Overseers were instructed to inspect broken equipment closely and to watch for slaves who lingered too long at the edge of the property. But even the harshest systems had cracks, and for a clever, desperate person, a cracked tool could become a crack in the wall. It was a dangerous gamble. Escape was not a romantic quest. Captured slaves were branded, mutilated, or crucified. In some cases, if a single slave escaped, the entire group could be punished, or even executed, as a warning to others. Roman law did not view these people as humans, but as property. Broken tools could be replaced. A broken spirit? That was the goal. And yet, they resisted. Not all rebellion was loud. Some of it was quiet, strategic, rooted in patience and pain. A splintered tool, a limped gait, a feigned gasp. These became acts of rebellion, a way to claim time, space, and opportunity in a world where none were given. Their names were never recorded in the grand histories of Rome. No statues, no epics, but we know they existed because the estates wrote about their absence, because tools were found snapped clean with no signs of use, because escape routes lined with discarded chains have been uncovered, rusted but real, and because every system of oppression breeds ingenuity in the oppressed. Slavery in ancient Rome was a vast, complex institution. There were household slaves, educated scribes, and gladiators. But it was the agricultural slaves, those in the countryside, who endured the harshest conditions. Far from the public eye, they worked under brutal regimens with little hope of manumission. And yet, the fields where they were chained also offered something else: concealment. Thick groves, steep hills, riverbanks overgrown with reeds. The landscape itself became an ally, and when the moment came, a snapped blade, a distracted guard, a shift change at dusk, they ran. Not every escape ended in freedom, but every escape attempt was an act of defiance, a reminder that even in the most rigid systems, human beings seek breath, autonomy, dignity. A single cracked tool could be the start of a rebellion, not against the empire, but against fate, and that rebellion still echoes. In the stones of Roman ruins, in the bent metal of abandoned plows, in the quiet history of those who refused to remain invisible. So, when we study the Roman Empire with all its grandeur, we must also study the cracks, the silences, the stories hidden not in marble, but in clay and rust. Stories of people who risked everything for a single night under the stars, unchained. And sometimes, it all started with the sound of a tool breaking. The worker who buried a curse beneath the throne. The throne was heavy, carved from cedar, inlaid with gold, raised high on polished stone beneath the burning light of Babylon's sun. It was meant to last forever, but deep beneath it, hidden where no priest or king would dare to look, was a curse, a small, sharp-edged piece of lead, buried in silence by someone no one ever noticed, a worker, a servant, a man with nothing, except rage. It was in the age of Nebuchadnezzar or one of his heirs, when Babylon soared in wealth and ambition. The hanging gardens bloomed in the desert, towering ziggurats clawed toward the heavens. From the royal palace, commands echoed across the empire. Every stone was laid by hand. Every seat, every gate, every wall was built by laborers. The king gave the orders, but the workers gave the blood. And one of them, somehow, somewhere, had enough. He was a servant in the palace, a nameless figure, maybe a cook or a mason or a cleaner of the temple floors, but he had access to the throne room and to the foundation beneath it. No one saw him slip the lead tablet under the stone. No one noticed the stolen blade tip from the kitchens, the way it pressed into metal with a steady, angry hand. The message wasn't decorative, it wasn't poetic, it was brutal primitive, and unforgettable. It read something like this: "May the flesh of the king rot in the sun. May his blood turn to dust. May every lie he speaks poison the air around him. May his name be spat out by the gods." Inscribed not in official script, but in jagged, hacked cuneiform. Deep grooves dug with the point of a broken utensil. It was not meant for the king. It was not meant for the priests. It was meant for the universe. For the gods who watched. For time itself. Lead was not chosen by accident. In the ancient world, lead was known as a metal of weight, darkness, permanence. The Greeks and Babylonians alike believed it could bind curses to the soul, that it could act as a kind of spiritual anchor, holding pain in place until justice arrived. The worker finished, he wrapped the tablet in linen, and then he buried it, beneath the very stone upon which the king would sit. Day after day, week after week, the ruler gave decrees from that seat, unaware that beneath his feet lay the hatred of a man he never saw, a man who cooked his food, or scrubbed his floors, or hauled bricks for his towers. For centuries the tablet lay untouched. Babylon rose and fell, the palaces crumbled, the throne was broken, and in time sand covered everything. Until archaeologists, digging through the ruins of Babylon, uncovered it, a small, unassuming slab of lead beneath what had once been a raised platform. The throne was long gone, but the curse had remained. They deciphered the cuneiform slowly, recognizing its rough craftsmanship. Not the hand of a royal scribe, but someone untrained. The language was vulgar, direct. There were no pleas for mercy, only commands for vengeance. And though the king it condemned had died thousands of years before, something in the words still burned. This wasn't just a relic. It was a wound. The discovery shook historians, because while curses had been found before, etched on tablets, sealed in tombs, whispered in magic spells, this one was different. It wasn't ritual. It wasn't part of a ceremony. It was personal, raw. A worker who had no other way to fight back. He couldn't raise a sword. He couldn't gather a rebellion, but he could carve his hate into metal and bury it beneath a symbol of power. And somehow, impossibly, he was heard. Because now, thousands of years later, we speak of him. Not the king, whose name history has mostly forgotten, but the man who dared to curse him. A forgotten servant who reached across time to deliver a message we still remember. In the end, that might be the most powerful magic of all, not the words of gods, but the fury of the voiceless. The man who had nothing left to give but his bitterness, and found a way to make it eternal. His curse didn't topple an empire, but it outlived one. So the next time you hear stories of thrones and kings, remember this. Power may shine from above, but truth sometimes sleeps below, buried in lead, waiting to be read by those willing to dig. The architect who built a flaw on purpose, there it stood. Massive, gleaming, divine, an arch of stone rising toward the desert sky, commissioned by a Persian king whose word was law, whose wealth was endless, whose ego was vast. It was to be a monument to his greatness, a gateway into eternity. And when it was finally revealed, the crowd gasped in awe. But one man, only one, saw the flaw, a single brick, just barely out of alignment, the curve ever so slightly shy of perfection. The king didn't notice, the court didn't notice, no one dared mention it, but the man who built it had placed it that way on purpose. His name is lost to time, perhaps intentionally, but the legend remains. A Persian architect, working under the rule of a mighty Shah, was tasked with creating the most beautiful royal arch the empire had ever seen. It was to represent the heavens, the gateway to divine order, something flawless, eternal, and he built it, magnificent, symmetrical, radiant in the sunlight. But at the final moment, as he laid the last few stones, he made a choice. He lowered one brick, not enough to collapse it, not enough to ruin it, but just enough to disturb the harmony. One brick, one flaw. When the king finally walked beneath the arch, he stopped. He turned. Something was wrong. Not broken, just not perfect. He demanded the architect. And when the man stood before him, calm, composed, the king asked, furious, why he had dared to ruin the royal vision. The architect bowed low and replied, "Because perfection belongs to the gods, not to kings, and certainly not to men." There was silence. not from fear, from awe. In a world where rulers claimed divinity, where kings demanded worship, this was more than defiance. It was philosophy carved into stone, a whisper of humility in an age of monuments to pride. In ancient Persia, architecture wasn't just engineering, it was a mirror of the cosmos. Every arch, every tile, every pattern was symbolic. The dome represented the heavens. The minarets, fingers reaching for the divine, and symmetry. It wasn't just beauty, it was order. It was sacred. But too much perfection could tempt arrogance. There is a recurring theme in many ancient cultures, a built-in flaw. Islamic artists, for example, sometimes introduced deliberate asymmetry into mosaics, fearing that to strive for true perfection was to rival God. Navajo weavers left a small, intentional imperfection in every rug, a spirit line, to allow the soul to escape. And in this story, the Persian architect made a choice to humble not himself, but the very seat of power he served. He wasn't punished. He wasn't executed. The king, it said, walked away in silence. Because deep down, even tyrants know the truth, that what lasts forever cannot be flawless. It must bend. It must err, or it crumbles beneath its own weight. The arch still stood. In fact, it endured longer than many of the king's own proclamations. Stone outlives ego. That one flawed brick became a symbol, not of error, but of restraint, of wisdom, of the human touch resisting the temptation to mimic the divine. The flaw became the soul of the structure. Today, the name of the king is debated. The location of the arch is uncertain. Perhaps it was in Ctesiphon. Perhaps Persepolis. Perhaps the story itself has drifted between legend and truth, sandblasted by time. But that brick remains. In every great design that avoids perfection, in every artist who resists the urge to finish something too cleanly, in every craftsman who knows that the point of beauty is not godhood, but grace, and in every builder who dares to say, "We are not gods, we are human." And sometimes, that's the most powerful statement of all. The tunnel diggers who swapped dirt with sand, they dug in silence, because the wrong sound could mean death. Somewhere in the blistering heat of the Assyrian Empire, long before Rome, before Greece, a group of enslaved men moved slowly through the dark earth beneath a fortress. Shackled in labor, watched day and night, they were told to dig, to build, to never stop. But instead of digging toward life, they were digging toward freedom. The Assyrians were masters of power. Their empire was brutal, organized, and unrelenting. They enslaved conquered peoples by the tens of thousands, forcing them to build walls, temples, tunnels, often to protect the very cities that enslaved them. Rebellion was unthinkable. Any hint of disobedience meant execution. But these men had a plan. They worked in the tunnels, underground passages beneath a fortified city, meant to transport materials or water, or to provide shelter during siege. The tunnels were reinforced by compact soil and stone, carefully arranged to prevent collapse. But the slaves, unnoticed in the dim, flickering torchlight, began a dangerous replacement. Where packed earth once stood, they quietly replaced it with sand, scoop by scoop, hour by hour. No one noticed. To the overseers, the walls still looked solid, but anyone who knows construction knows the truth. Sand shifts. It doesn't bind. It waits for pressure, for time, for the right moment to fall apart. That was the point. The slaves weren't just escaping. They were buying time. Sand wouldn't collapse right away. It would hold until it didn't. Until perhaps weeks or months later, when soldiers passed through or heavy cargo was dragged above. Then, in an instant, the tunnel would give way, and the collapse wouldn't just trap, it would bury. No one would ever suspect the diggers. By the time the collapse came, they'd be long gone. Ancient records speak of tunnel sabotage in several civilizations, but Assyrian documents, cuneiform tablets unearthed from ruins, describe mysterious tunnel failures beneath key cities, in Nineveh, in Kalhu, collapses that puzzled engineers of the time. Some modern archaeologists now believe these may not have been failures at all, but acts of resistance written in soil. Consider the brilliance of it. These were not educated men in the way we think of today. They were laborers, prisoners, farmers, but they understood physics, pressure, time, the subtle art of collapse. And they used their only tool, the earth itself, as a weapon. They knew they would not be followed. The city would see only rubble, no clues, No footprints, just a buried passage and a vanished workforce. This wasn't just escape, it was revenge in slow motion. And yet, there is something deeper here, something haunting. These men escaped, yes, but they also knew the collapse might kill others. Innocents, maybe, guards, fellow laborers. But in a world where cruelty ruled, where their lives were bought and sold, the morality blurred. The question was no longer, is this right? But, is this the only way? They carved their answer into the foundations of the empire and made the empire collapse under its own weight. Today, when archaeologists dig through Assyrian ruins, they often find strange layers, sand where compacted earth should be, walls that seem to have failed without cause. And while no record names the slaves, no inscription tells their story, the soil itself whispers it. Every collapsed tunnel is a memory, a scar, a map to freedom drawn beneath the earth. And perhaps, somewhere beneath our own cities, there are still echoes of their passage, of men who dug not to build, but to escape, who swapped earth for sand and silence for revolution. Because sometimes the greatest rebellion is not a shout, it's a scoop of sand in the dark. The farmer who hid maps in weaving patterns equal sign. It looked like a blanket, soft, hand-woven, dyed with earthy reds and muted gold. It hung from a wooden peg inside a peasant's home in rural China. To the casual eye, it was a simple textile, a symbol of daily life, of tradition, of toil. But for those who knew what to look for, it was a map of resistance, a guide to survival, a plan to fight an empire. During the Qing dynasty, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, China's rural interior was under increasing control. The imperial tax system expanded, land ownership tightened. Resistance to land seizure to Assau and forced labor was brutally punished. Rebellion meant execution. But still, it simmered. Among the peasants, farmers, weavers, and herders grew secret networks. They couldn't use paper. Paper could be burned. Letters could be intercepted. But textiles? Textiles were everywhere, and nobody questioned a woman weaving at her loom. So they used thread as ink, color as code, weave as memory. Patterns that looked like rivers were roads. Rows of tiny diamond shapes marked elevation shifts. The placement of red versus yellow signified safe zones versus imperial patrols. Directional cues were hidden in border motifs. Entire routes, through fields, around checkpoints, into mountain passes, were encoded into blankets, sashes, and shawls. A single textile could carry a journey hundreds of kilometers long. And the brilliance of it was this. Even if the Qing officials held it in their hands, they would never see the map. These were not crude sketches. They were masterworks of covert design. Peasant women, often the primary weavers, were the unsung intelligence officers of their time. They memorized geography not with parchment, but with muscle memory. Every thread carried intent. Every row was a secret. One such farmer, whose name has been lost to time but whose work survived in legend, lived in the hills of Guizhou province. He was a quiet man by trade, growing millet, tending to goats. But by night, with his wife at the loom, he became a cartographer of defiance. They helped fugitive rebels escape capture by guiding them through trails known only to locals. The maps they wove weren't abstract, they were accurate. Crossroads, bridges, even dead trees used as hiding spots, woven in silk and cotton. And if they were questioned, the fabric was just a gift, a family heirloom, a bridal wrap. Sometimes the map was woven into a belt meant to be worn. Other times, into baby carriers or wall hangings. Imperial soldiers never suspected. They had no reason to suspect. In their minds, peasants were illiterate, simple, voiceless. But thread is a language. The use of hidden cartography and textiles wasn't limited to one village or dynasty. It appeared in multiple regions across China's southwestern frontier, particularly among ethnic minority groups like the Miao and the Dong, who were frequently in conflict with central rule. To them, weaving was not just survival, it was resistance, and the empire never saw it coming. Centuries later, textile scholars began to notice strange anomalies in surviving peasant fabrics, patterns that broke tradition, motifs repeated with odd precision, color combinations that didn't follow ceremonial logic. When cross-referenced with topographical data, the truth emerged. These weren't just decorations. They were directions. It's easy to forget how powerful small acts of resistance can be. When we think of rebellion, we think of swords, fire, proclamations. But this was a mother's hand weaving freedom into fabric, a father memorizing mountain paths through the fingers of his wife's loom. No bloodshed, no banners, just knowledge, hidden in plain sight. And that's what makes it terrifyingly brilliant. In a time of absolute power, censorship, and surveillance, a farmer and his family outwitted an empire with nothing but thread. Today, those textiles are priceless. Museums hold a few. Others remain in private hands, misunderstood, folded in trunks, mistaken for ordinary folk art. But to those who know, they are maps. Not just of geography, but of spirit, of quiet defiance, of people who could not write their story, so they wove it. The empire wanted obedience. What it got instead was genius disguised as tradition. The next time you see an old piece of fabric, ask yourself, what might be hidden between the threads? What journey? What truth? What resistance? Because sometimes the simplest object in the poorest hands can hold the most dangerous idea of all: freedom. The builder who made the castle collapse. Years later, in the rolling hills of medieval France, a fortress once stood. A proud monument to feudal power. Its walls were thick, its towers high, its battlements meant to defy time itself. The castle had seen sieges, storms, and centuries of wear, but it wasn't war that brought it down. It wasn't fire or earthquake. It was a man. A single man with a chisel in one hand and vengeance in his heart. Somewhere in the late 13th century, as construction on the castle neared completion, a master stoneworker was dismissed. Some say it was a dispute over wages. Others believe he was accused of theft or insulted by a noble. The details are lost, scattered like mortar flakes in the wind. But one thing is clear: he left angry. And before he walked away, he made a decision. With no one watching, he altered the course of stone. He worked in silence, among the dozens of masons, apprentices, and laborers, shaping the final phases of the wall. But in a section near the southern buttress, a place critical to the castle's structural integrity, he made subtle changes. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to matter. He undercut a few stones, left hairline gaps in mortar joints, shifted a keystone by a fraction of an inch. To any supervisor, the work would look sound. The wall would pass inspection. But over time, decades later, it would fail. And that was his plan. Sabotage hidden in plain stone. At first, the castle stood proud. Generations passed. Lords came and went. The wall bore banners, withstood winds, and seemed eternal. But the stress was growing, quietly, invisibly. Each winter frost crept into the cracks. Each summer heat expanded the gaps. The load shifted. Slowly, relentlessly, until one day it gave. Eyewitness records from the 14th century tell of a sudden thunder-like roar. A section of the southern curtain wall collapsed inward, crushing part of the armory and taking 3 guards with it. There was no battle, no tremor, no warning. Just stone, surrendering to the ghost of a grudge. The castle's lord, furious and confused, ordered an investigation. Engineers, such as they were in the medieval age, examined the fallen masonry. What they found baffled them. The base stones had been unevenly supported, the mortar weak in places where it should have been strongest. No sabotage could be proven. But whispers spread among the stonemasons. This was no accident. Centuries later, modern archaeologists studying castle ruins in the region found something chilling. In the remaining stonework, tiny inconsistencies could be seen. Slight offsets, improper load distribution, and curious mortar choices inconsistent with other sections of the wall. One report noted that the collapse matched the kind of structural fatigue that would result from deliberate misalignment. In other words, someone had planned for it to fail. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. It is difficult to name this man. Medieval records rarely honored laborers. He likely died in obscurity, remembered only by fellow masons, or perhaps the innkeeper who poured his last drink. But in the stones, he left a signature, not carved, not painted, but in failure. And perhaps that was the point. In an age where laborers were disposable, where noblemen commissioned monuments to their power, but seldom paid fairly for the sweat that raised them, sabotage became the last language of protest. Castles were built not just with stone and lime, but with bitterness, resentment, and the memory of unpaid debts. This wasn't an isolated act. Across Europe, there are whispers, stone arches that collapsed too soon, staircases that wore down unevenly, towers that shifted over time. Many of these were blamed on poor design or natural wear, but masons knew better. The medieval building site was a world of hierarchy, pride, and quiet resistance, and sometimes vengeance took decades to bloom. The castle collapse in France became a local legend, a cursed wall, a vengeful spirit. But the real ghost was in the craftsmanship, a builder who, denied justice, let time become his accomplice. It's a chilling reminder, not all sabotage is loud. Not all rebellion happens in the open. Sometimes it's buried deep in the foundation, waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. So, the next time you walk among the ruins of a fortress or gaze up at an ancient wall, remember the hands that built it. Not the lords who ordered it, but the men beneath the scaffolds, the ones who mixed mortar with calloused fingers, the ones who swallowed their rage, or carved it, brick by brick, into history. The potter who mocked royalty on the underside. In the golden age of ancient Greece, when cities gleamed with marble and tyrants wrapped themselves in robes of divinity, artisans served quietly behind the scenes. Among them were the potters, humble craftsmen shaping the vessels of daily life. They were commissioned by the elite to mold clay into beauty, to paint tales of heroism and gods upon vases and plates. But one of them, perhaps more than one, had another story to tell. A story they painted on the underside. To the wealthy, these plates were masterpieces. Scenes of kings in triumph, gods blessing battlefields, rulers feasting under divine light. They were passed proudly across banquet tables, admired by nobles, raised in toasts. But the true message was never meant for them. Because if you flipped one of those plates over, if you were a servant washing it in the dim light of a palace kitchen, you might see something different. A hidden world. A face twisted into caricature. A king with a donkey's ears. A general tripping over his own sword. A queen feeding grapes to a goat dressed as a prince. They were not accidental. They were satire. Sharp, deliberate, dangerous. Painted not on the front, but beneath, where only the lowest in society, the ones forced to clean up after the rich, would ever see them. These weren't childish jokes. They were acts of rebellion. Clay-baked resistance. Because in a world where free speech could mean exile or death, the potter found a loophole. Royalty looked only at the top, only the side meant for display. They never cared to turn things over. That was beneath them. And that's exactly where the truth was. Archaeologists have since unearthed a handful of such pieces. Dishes and cups where the elegant, reverent exteriors give way, on the bottom, to crude, satirical sketches. Sometimes etched faintly with a needle, sometimes painted in miniature detail, using the same brush that glorified kings on the other side. One plate shows a known warlord being chased by chickens. Another depicts a councilman with his mouth sewn shut by a serpent. One, nearly missed entirely, shows the feet of a famous philosopher stepping into a pile of dung, subtle, hidden near the foot ring. But to the servant scrubbing the plate after the feast, the message would have been unmistakable. These images weren't just jokes, they were catharsis, a secret language between the oppressed, a wink from one laborer to another across time and class. Because pottery was everywhere. It touched every table, every hand, from the poorest household to the king's own court. And that meant the potter, for all his low status, had access. Not to power, but to observation, to irony, to truth. He watched as aristocrats commissioned images of themselves as gods. He painted their idealized likenesses with one hand and mocked them with the other. And he wasn't caught. Because he knew where to hide the truth, in plain sight, beneath their pride. It makes you wonder how many of these secret images have been lost. How many broken shards once held whispered laughter. How many royal banquets were served on dishes hiding ridicule just millimeters away from royal hands. Even now, museums sometimes miss them. A dish labeled with mythological triumph may have, on its underside, a sketch that rewrites the whole meaning. The potter knew that irony could outlive empires, that clay, once fired, would endure longer than any king's legacy, and he was right. We don't know his name. He likely died in obscurity, never praised, never credited. But we know his mind. We can see it in the brushstrokes, the hidden grins, the inked smirks fired forever into ceramic, a subversive fingerprint beneath a polished world. The potter who mocked royalty didn't raise an army or lead a revolt, but he made people laugh in silence. He made servants feel seen, and he proved that even in the tightest grip of power, there is always a crack where truth can grow. So the next time you lift a beautiful plate and admire its surface, remember, what lies beneath may say more than what's on display. Because sometimes the real story is on the underside. The worker who used a dust trail to communicate. Deep beneath the earth, where no sunlight reached, there were no words, only dust. The Roman mines were hell carved into stone. Prisoners, slaves, and condemned men were lowered into the pits not to serve, but to vanish. They were nameless bodies fueling an empire, forced to work in darkness with lungs full of metal dust and backs scarred by whips. They knew that escape was fantasy and silence was survival. But even there, language found a way. In the mines of Roman Spain and Dacia, where silver and gold were scraped from the bones of the earth, men began to whisper not with voices, but with movements. Not with sound, but with the shifting of dust. It began with a worker, a prisoner whose name is lost to time. He hauled baskets of ore day after day, barefoot, chained, half-starved. But he noticed something. The paths he walked left marks. Not just footprints, trails, dust grooves, sweeping arcs from baskets, dragged lines from broken tools. The floor, it turned out, remembered everything. And he had an idea. He began to drag his basket in patterns, not random, but deliberate. A leftward loop meant food was hidden. A jagged zigzag meant danger, guards nearby. A straight line between pillars, slightly curved at the end, meant someone was planning escape. It was primitive. It was fragile. A single footstep could erase it. But it worked. Because the other workers, those half-broken souls who no longer looked one another in the eye, noticed. They began to understand. And slowly this silent system became their voice. A dust trail became a sentence. A smear became a warning. A spiral became hope. Roman mines were designed to crush rebellion. The work was brutal. Air was poisoned by arsenic and mercury. The punishment for theft or disobedience was death, swift, public, and usually meaningless. Yet, in the deepest levels of these tunnels, men were speaking in the only language they could, the language of ground code. Scribes never wrote about it. No Roman noble ever acknowledged it. But archaeology remembers. In the abandoned mine shafts of Rio Tinto and Alburnus Mayor, researchers have found odd wear patterns etched into stone floors, marks too specific to be random, paths too deliberate to be accidental. Not decorative, not structural, but communicative. Some even theorize that these marks evolved into a kind of shared map, where food caches were hidden, where sympathetic overseers patrolled, where a tunnel wall was weak enough to dig through. The marks weren't words, but they were survival. We like to think of language as something grand, written in ink or spoken with flourish. But this was different. This was language born in pain, carved from necessity, and used only in shadows. The man who started it never saw his name etched in marble. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a general. He was just a laborer. But he rewrote the rules of survival. His system spread, not in open rebellion, but in quiet solidarity. New prisoners learned the code quickly. It became second nature. If you wanted to live, you had to watch the floor, read the dust, understand the dance of dragging baskets across stone. Eventually, when a tunnel collapsed and killed dozens, the surviving miners used the code to coordinate a sit-in, refusing to work until the dead were buried with dignity. It was the closest thing to a labor protest ancient Roman mines had ever seen. It didn't last. The guards beat them. Several were executed. But the message had traveled. Even in silence, they could be heard. And after that, the guards watched the ground more carefully. Some began to erase the marks as they found them. Others ignored them, too afraid to acknowledge what was growing beneath their feet. A network of resistance made not of tools, but of dust. It's easy to forget these people. History rarely honors slaves and prisoners, but without them, the Roman Empire would have starved. Its economy was forged in those tunnels, its coins born from crushed bone and blind labor. And in that darkness, someone invented a way to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't write. He dragged his basket with a purpose, and in doing so, gave the voiceless a way to shout without ever making a sound. Today we marvel at Roman aqueducts, amphitheaters, and roads, but deep underground, in the places no one wanted to look, the real genius was survival, communication, memory preserved not on scrolls, but on stone dust floors, and somewhere, in the deepest corners of a mine now long abandoned, the faint trail of a basket still loops around a stone and still whispers, "You are not alone." The carpenter who left a secret door, unlocked equal sign, deep beneath the sands of Egypt, in the stillness of tombs built for gods and kings, there was once a wall, but not just any wall. It looked like stone. It sounded like stone. It was painted with divine symbols, guarded by spells, and sealed in ritual. But behind that wall, someone had made a choice no one saw, until it was too late. In the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, security was an obsession. Architects designed traps, carvers crafted false corridors, builders laid slabs of granite thicker than doors to seal the dead away from the world. And for good reason. Tomb robbing was a national crisis. Entire teams were executed for failing to protect a royal burial. The belief was simple. A sealed tomb meant immortality. To be disturbed was to be erased. But one carpenter didn't believe in forever. We'll never know his name, just his work. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, during the twilight of Egypt's new kingdom, tombs became more elaborate, and their traps more paranoid. The builders were sworn to secrecy. Workers were often killed or exiled after construction, just to keep the layout hidden. And yet, someone, a single man, made a change. Instead of sealing a stone wall solid, he left a thin, hollow panel. Plaster and paint disguised it. From the outside, it looked identical to the others, but it was different, lighter, weaker. Designed, perhaps, to break, not by accident, but by design. Why? Some believe it was greed, a secret deal. The carpenter may have been bribed by robbers, shown a handful of gold in exchange for future access. Others believe it was revenge, anger at a corrupt foreman, or the cruelty of a system that buried its laborers in poverty while the pharaohs bathed in obsidian jars. Or maybe, just maybe, it was legacy. Because years, maybe decades later, the robbers came, and they didn't enter through the main passage. They didn't break the stone door or fall into the decoy shafts. They went straight to the hollow panel, chiseled softly, carefully, quietly, and slipped through like whispers in the dark. Inside, they looted everything. Amulets, weapons, golden masks. Sacred texts were torn, the body of the king disturbed. The priest would later find the remains scattered, the magic broken. No forced entry, no broken slab. Just a flaw in the wall, perfectly hidden, almost as if it had been waiting. And when the wall was examined, centuries later, modern archaeologists noticed it. One section was lighter, thinner, patched, and behind it, the entryway the robbers used, a secret door left unlocked by intent. We'll never know what went through the carpenter's mind that day. Maybe he thought the tomb too full of lies to deserve peace. Maybe he whispered an apology to the pharaoh as he laid the final plaster. Or maybe he smiled, knowing that one day, long after he was gone, the mighty would be humbled by one man's hands. The Egyptians believed your soul could be destroyed if your tomb was violated. That if no one remembered your name, you ceased to exist in the afterlife. And yet, ironically, it was the nameless carpenter who ensured that the tomb would be remembered. Not for its perfection, but for its imperfection, for the flaw in the stone, for the silence that was broken. Today, in museum cases, fragments of that robbed tomb sit behind glass, the grave goods of kings. But every time you see them, remember, they should have stayed buried forever. They didn't, because one man decided to leave a door slightly open. Not all sabotage is loud. Some is elegant, some is careful, and some is made of wood and dust, designed to look like stone. The carpenter never saw the gold again. He never stood in the darkness of the open tomb. But in one thin panel, he carved his rebellion. And in doing so, he reminded the world, even the dead can be betrayed by the living who build their walls. The servant who used a comb to record abuse. It looked like nothing, just a small worn comb made of olive wood. The kind of thing a servant girl might keep tucked in her sash. No one would have given it a second glance. But along the spine were marks, tiny notches, dozens of them, carved carefully, deliberately, not from vanity, not for decoration, but for memory. One mark for each time she was beaten, in the shadowed households of ancient Greece, where marble columns hid quiet violence and women were property before they were people. Servants lived in silence. They were bought, inherited, or born into bondage. Their names were often forgotten. Their lives reduced to work, obedience, and fear. And yet, one servant found a way to leave behind her truth. She had no ink, no parchment, no right to speak. But she had this: a comb. Every time the blow landed, every time the lashes were dealt or her food was withheld, she took it out. And with the tip of a pin or a bone needle, she scratched a line. One, then another, then another. Each line, a wound remembered. Archaeologists found the comb centuries later, buried near the remains of a small rural home in Attica. It was preserved in ash, likely from a fire that had long erased the rest of the dwelling. At first, they assumed that the notches were accidental, wear from use or maybe decoration, but the spacing was too precise, too rhythmic, too intentional. This was a record. They counted the marks, over 60. The comb itself was handmade, not by a professional, but likely carved by the servant herself. The teeth were uneven, the wood rough, but it was hers. In a world where she owned nothing, not her time, not her body, she owned this object, and she made it speak. She had no hope of escape. There were no courts that would listen to her, no temples where her cries would be answered. Her abuser may have been a wealthy man, or a cruel mistress, or even another servant, higher in rank. But she knew what they tried to erase, that every act of cruelty could still be counted. Ancient Greek society, for all its philosophers and orators, rarely recorded the lives of the enslaved or the domestically oppressed. There are no surviving diaries of servant girls, no courtroom testimonies from beaten kitchen hands. But in the silence, this comb breaks through. It speaks with no words. It accuses with no names. But it demands we listen. And what's most haunting is that it was never meant to be found. She didn't carve it for history. She carved it for herself. A way to say, this happened. A way to remember, even if no one else ever would. Because memory, for the powerless, is resistance. She couldn't run, she couldn't fight back, but she could count. And each mark was a refusal to forget, a refusal to let pain become invisible. We will never know her name. We will never see her face. But we know what she felt. We can imagine her fingers moving in the dark, her eyes scanning the room before slipping the comb from her sash, the scratch of wood against wood, the sharp breath, the moment of quiet defiance. In that act, she joined an invisible lineage of countless women and servants across history who found ways to record what the world wanted buried, through embroidery, through pottery, through songs whispered to sleeping children, and in this case, through a comb. Today, the comb sits in a museum drawer, rarely displayed, but for those who study it, it's a masterpiece of silent testimony, a story told in scars, a diary carved from pain, a history etched in the humblest tool. It reminds us that not all rebellions are loud. Some are measured in scratches, in lines, in marks hidden behind the teeth of a comb. So, the next time someone tells you history is written by the victors, remember this. Sometimes the oppressed leave messages too. Quiet ones, fragile ones, ones that take centuries to hear. But once uncovered, they do not let go. The laborer who smuggled notes inside bread. In the dim corridors of a medieval castle, few things moved unnoticed. Guards paced, eyes sharp. Servants whispered carefully. Walls had ears, and sometimes knives. And yet, day after day, something passed through the gates unchecked. Something so ordinary, so common, it aroused no suspicion at all. Bread. But within those crusts, baked into the daily loaves, a revolution stirred. In 14th century England, the castle was more than a fortress. It was a machine. Kitchens roared from sunrise to dusk. Bread was produced in enormous quantities to feed everyone from knights to scullery boys. And bakers were everywhere. Local, transient, often overlooked. They passed in and out of kitchens with baskets slung over shoulders, sleeves dusted with flour, heads bowed low. No one suspected the baker, but someone should have. Because in those warm, fragrant loaves, hidden between layers of dough, rebels passed messages. Real parchment notes, smuggled inside the bread itself. Historians studying records of peasant uprisings, particularly around the time of the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, have uncovered curious evidence, mentions of secret communications moving by crust and crumb. In certain rebellious regions, Kent, Essex, and beyond, bakers became couriers. Loaves were baked with hollows at their center, still warm when handed off in the kitchen, a cut here, a fold there, then sealed shut with wet dough and baked again until the message inside was completely concealed. Castle guards searched satchels and sleeves, but they never tore open the bread. And that was the genius of it. In one recorded account, a kitchen laborer at Rochester Castle was caught reading a crumpled slip of parchment hidden in a bread roll. He was whipped and imprisoned, but not before rumors spread. Messages were moving unseen, from village to castle, from serf to soldier, from servant to rebel leader. What did the messages say? Some warned of tax collectors' routes. Others called for support, naming gathering places and dates. A few were simply declarations. The king serves the rich. God serves the poor. And some contained lists, names of nobles to be targeted when the rebellion came. These weren't grand conspiracies orchestrated by generals. They were grassroots revolts fueled by starvation, taxation, and injustice. And the bread-carried notes were their bloodstream, moving information quietly, invisibly, through the kitchens of power. Even when caught, many bakers escaped serious punishment. After all, who could prove they had written the notes? Some pretended ignorance, others feigned innocence, blaming apprentices. But the authorities began watching more closely. In some castles, bread deliveries were broken apart in front of guards. In others, outside bakers were banned entirely, forcing castles to rely on internal kitchens. Still, the messages found new ways in. Tucked into pies, sealed in folded cheesecloth, inked on the inside of eggshells. But it was the bread that became legend, because it symbolized the rebellion of the invisible, the laborer who needed flour at dawn and risked his life by hiding a note in a loaf did not fight with swords. He fought with silence, with flour-dusted hands and a knowing glance. He weaponized the most innocent thing he had, and in doing so, he turned the castle's own hunger into its weakness. This was the hidden war beneath the banners and battlements, not fought in armor, but in aprons, and sometimes it worked. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebel forces stormed castles and manors across southern England. They moved quickly, striking with shocking coordination. Some historians now believe this was made possible in part by underground messages. Messages carried not by noble messengers on horseback, but by barefoot bakers passing bread. The rebellion was eventually crushed. Many were executed. The laborer who once smuggled notes may have been among them, forgotten in the dust of history. But the method, this edible espionage, remains one of the most fascinating glimpses into medieval resistance. Bread, the symbol of survival, became a vessel of defiance. So, the next time you tear into a crusty loaf, remember, in another century, that very crust might have hidden a revolution. And somewhere, in a castle kitchen, a nameless laborer might have smiled quietly as a noble bit into his breakfast, unaware that rebellion had passed right beneath his nose. The quarrymen who marked dangerous faults on purpose. The cliffs were beautiful, majestic, white-faced, and towering. To the kings who ordered their stones to be mined, they were monuments in waiting, raw material for palaces, tombs, temples, and cities. But to the quarrymen, they were something else. A warning. In the ancient world, from Egypt to Anatolia, from Greece to the mountains of Mesopotamia, quarrying stone was a sacred and deadly business. The men who did it were not slaves. They were experts, skilled with hammers, wedges, and chisels. They knew how to read the stone like scripture. They could hear a fracture in a wall before it cracked. They knew where death slept, hidden in the veins of rock. And when they were forced to carve into unstable cliffs, when the kings demanded stone from places they knew would one day fall, they did something remarkable. They warned us. Carved into the rock faces, often faint, often dismissed as tool marks or rough signatures, are what archaeologists now believe to be a system of messages. silent signals left by quarrymen for those who would come after them, chisel marks in specific shapes, arranged in unnatural patterns, at first thought to be routine cuts, until researchers began noticing where they were found, always at known fault lines, always where collapses eventually occurred. One set of marks was found in the crumbling walls of an abandoned Egyptian quarry near Aswan, another in the cliffside marble mines of ancient Greece. Deep within the rock, workers carved small, repeating slashes, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, other times in crisscross patterns. No inscriptions, no names, just marks. They weren't random. These weren't used for splitting stone or aligning cuts. They were messages. Not for kings, not for priests, but for future quarrymen, those who would return decades or centuries later to dig again. The marks said, "Here, the rock is unstable. Here, the stone will betray you. Here, someone once died." Because quarrying was generational. Fathers taught sons. Techniques were passed down like sacred rites. And when a cliff showed signs of weakness, when the sound of a hammer echoed wrong, or the stone trembled underfoot, they knew. They could feel it in their bones. But they couldn't stop. The kings didn't listen. They needed more stone, more monuments, more legacy carved into the earth. And the workers obeyed. Because refusing meant punishment. Death. Or worse, the death of someone else. So, they carved the stone they were ordered to take, but they left their marks behind, a form of silent protest, a map for the unseen, a way of shouting across time, "We knew, we saw, we warned you." And sometimes it worked. Years later, a new team would come to the quarry, a son of a stonemason. He'd see the marks, stop the crew, move the site. Lives were saved not by science or survey, but by symbols left in stone by those who came before. And sometimes it didn't work. The kings ignored the warnings, ordered deeper cuts, bigger loads, and the cliffs fell. Entire ledges collapsed, crushing dozens. There are records, half erased, whispered through temple scrolls, of quarry disasters so severe the gods were blamed. But beneath the myth, the truth was carved all along. We often forget the lives sacrificed beneath our cities. We marvel at ancient temples without wondering who pulled the stones. We admire the symmetry of columns without asking who fell beneath them. But the quarrymen remembered each other. They passed down warnings not in books, but in gouges, scratches, scars in the rock. And even now, in the dust-filled silence of forgotten quarries, those marks remain. Geologists today sometimes find fault lines, hairline cracks invisible to the eye, by following the patterns left by men long dead. Their primitive symbols align with modern fault mapping. Their instincts, formed by generations of sweat and blood, match the findings of satellite scans. The marks were real, the danger was real, and the courage it took to leave them was immeasurable. They didn't write their names. They didn't beg for praise. They just left the truth, hammered into the bones of the earth. So the next time you stand before a temple, a palace, a mountain of marble stairs, remember this: it was once a cliff. And someone long ago stood at its base, felt the tremble in the stone, and tried to warn us. And if we still know where to look, their messages are still there. The builder who made echoes reveals secrets. There are walls that protect and walls that imprison. But in one ancient Chinese palace, there was a hallway that did something far stranger. It listened. Stone. Silence. Whispers that traveled farther than they should have. And a design so precise, so cunning, that sound could leap across distance like a secret on wings. This was no accident. It was the work of one man, a builder not of bricks alone, but of silence, sound, and subversion. His name has been lost to history, perhaps erased, perhaps buried on purpose, but his creation still stands. In the curved corridors of imperial China, where emperors ruled with absolute power and silence could mean survival, one architect bent physics to his will. He constructed what appeared to be a simple corridor, winding through gardens and chambers of the palace. But when you stepped into it, something strange happened. A whisper, barely audible, could travel from one end to the other. Not shouted, not echoed, whispered. They called it the Whispering Hall. The emperors believed it was a marvel, a symbol of power. that even quiet words could carry through their palace, as though the universe itself was listening. But they never understood the true purpose behind its curves, because the servants did. The Whispering Hall became a lifeline, an invisible thread connecting the voiceless. Eunuchs, concubines, maids, scribes, people who weren't supposed to speak unless spoken to, who weren't supposed to know more than what was handed to them. And yet, behind the lacquered doors and golden dragons, information flowed like water, carried not on scrolls, but in sound. The architect, it said, had grown up as a servant himself. He knew what it was to be invisible, to be in the room but never part of it, to watch, always, and say nothing. And so, when given the rare honor of designing part of the palace, he built more than a structure. He built a system, a hallway of secrets, a place where the powerless could speak to one another without ever being seen. The design was genius, a shallow curvature in the corridor's stone walls laid with polished tiles and exact spacing. The ceiling, subtly domed, caught and carried sound waves. Every angle was deliberate, every measurement tested, and when it was done, whispers from one end could be heard perfectly at the other, over 60 feet away, but only if you knew how to listen. At first, no one understood its purpose. Courtiers admired the elegance, guards patrolled it without suspicion. But the servants, they noticed. A strange echo, a sentence repeated too clearly, a warning passed from one end to the other with no messenger. Then the codes began. A phrase about tea meant danger. A poem recited backward meant the empress was weeping. The plum blossoms bloom early meant a secret was leaving the palace. These weren't just gossip. These were survival tools. In a palace where one wrong word could mean death, and one misunderstood glance could spark exile, the Whispering Hall became sacred, a lifeline, a communication artery for those who lived in shadows. It's said that once, when a high-ranking minister planned a quiet coup, the servants passed warnings down the corridor in riddles. Within hours, the empress had learned of it, not from guards or generals, but from whispers echoing off the walls. The coup was crushed before it began. No one ever suspected the hallway. To the outside world, it remained a decorative walkway, a curiosity of sound, a showpiece. The emperor himself believed it was his presence that carried weight through stone, that his very breath had power. But all the while, the truth lived beneath his nose. The very stones he walked on were listening. And the architect? He vanished soon after the hall was completed. Some say he was promoted to design another structure and disappeared into bureaucratic oblivion. Others say he was executed for knowing too much. But those who lived within the palace walls remembered him, not with titles, not with portraits, but in the way they leaned gently toward the curved wall and whispered. Centuries later, similar corridors were discovered in Buddhist temples and imperial gardens. Some believe the idea spread. Others say the servants themselves recreated the designs in miniature, using clay pots and water jars to bounce sound in the same way. The knowledge became folklore, then legend, then almost lost. But the Whispering Hall never forgot. It still stands, hidden behind restored walls in a forgotten wing of a palace museum. Tourists marvel at it, laughing at how clearly they can hear each other from across the distance. They call it magic. They don't realize it was once rebellion. A rebellion not of swords or flames, but of frequency and survival. Because long before modern microphones and encrypted messages, there was sound. And one man, once a servant, then a builder, used that sound not to serve power, but to subvert it. And to this day, if you walk down such a hall and whisper a truth to the stone, the walls may still carry it forward. For someone, somewhere, still listening. The slave who used a broken pot to escape chains. It started with a crack. Not a shout, not a sword, not a grand rebellion, just the sound of clay breaking in the corner of a Roman storeroom. And that's where history quietly turned. Because in a world ruled by steel and empire, one slave used a broken pot to escape the unbreakable. Rome was built on chains. Some gilded, some iron, but all binding. Slaves were the invisible engine of the empire, tending fields, building roads, serving wine. And for most, escape was a dream whispered only at night. Guards were everywhere. Punishment was brutal. The collar and the shackle made sure no one forgot who owned their body. But one man refused to stay owned. His name has been lost. But fragments of his story remain, passed down through merchant records, prison inventories, and a single line scrawled in Latin beside an empty set of chains. Vinctus fugit, vincula fracta. The bound man fled. His chains broken. The guards were baffled. There were no tools in the cell, no weapons, no tampering with the locks, just a small pile of clay shards in the corner. Useless, it seemed, until someone looked closer. One shard was different, smoothed, shaped, wedged with purpose. Archaeologists believe the man had been working in a storeroom, or perhaps a kitchen, somewhere near amphorae and storage jars, thick Roman pots used to hold wine, grain, or oil. He broke one, not by accident, but with intent. And then, over days, maybe weeks, he filed a shard down against stone, shaping it into a wedge, not sharp enough to cut, but strong enough to split. He waited, watched the guards, tested the rust in the chains, and when the time was right, he forced the wedge between the weakest link, driving it in with all his strength. The sound would have been quiet, a slow groan of iron yielding, not snapping. When it gave, he slipped free. But here's where the story becomes genius. Not just brave. He didn't flee immediately. He left behind a decoy. The man reassembled the broken pot, partially, into the vague shape of a foot or calf. He placed it where his leg would have been. In low light, with a quick glance, it looked like he was still there. Guards didn't check until dawn. By then, he was long gone. Some say he headed for the hills, others say he joined a merchant caravan. In some versions, he made it to Greece. In others, he vanishes. But one thing is certain, the escape left no trace of violence, no stormed gate, no fallen guard. Just a wedge, a decoy, and an empty shackle. Rome, for all its power, never imagined clay could beat iron. But that's what makes this story endure. Because it wasn't brute force that freed him, it was observation, patience, craft. The very skills his masters had used against him in labor, he turned into tools of resistance. He saw the world through a different lens, not as a prison, but as a puzzle. To break a pot wasn't a mistake, it was a beginning. Even today in museums across Europe, you'll find displays of Roman chains, heavy, intimidating, symbols of control. But every now and then, a curator will show something else, a shard of clay beside a rusted cuff. Labeled simply, tool of escape, believed crafted by slave. That's all that's left. But it's enough to remind us, not all resistance is loud. Not all revolution comes with fire. Sometimes, it's just one man, one wedge, and the belief that even an empire can be undone by the smallest crack. The goldsmith who crafted hollow coins for messages. To the king, it looked like any other coin, gleaming, perfect, stamped with royal insignia. It passed through hands across borders, through markets and palaces. It was trusted. It was currency. It was control. But hidden inside was rebellion. Under the weight of Assyrian rule, ruthless, sprawling, and watching, resistance had to become invisible. Every whisper risked exile. Every rumor could end on a spike. So, those who defied the empire needed something more clever than courage. They needed subversion disguised as loyalty. And that's where he came in. The goldsmith. He worked in the heart of the city, known for his precision, his loyalty to the crown, and his flawless touch. He crafted signet rings for governors, bracelets for priestesses, and coins, thousands of them. His shop was watched, inspected, praised. But deep behind the forge, in silence, he was doing something no one expected. He was making coins that opened, the hollow coins. 2 pieces, screwed together so tightly they seemed solid. No seams visible to the naked eye. Inside, they held something precious, not gold, not gems, but parchment. Paper. Scrolls so thin they could be rolled tighter than a finger. Messages, names, maps, orders, rebellion, hidden in plain sight. The process was a miracle of craftsmanship. The inner threads had to be carved so finely that they would not strip with time. The fit had to be exact, or the deception would fail. Once closed, the coin felt real. It rang with the same weight. It bore the mark of the Assyrian king. No one ever suspected. The scrolls were written by candlelight. Sometimes just a single line, "He rides tonight," or they move at dawn. Other times, they held full orders for uprisings, coded lists of allies, instructions to poison a well or to light a fire as signal. These coins moved across borders faster than spies, tucked into purses, traded in markets, dropped in the hands of sympathizers who knew how to twist them open. And the king, proud in his palace, surrounded by gold, never knew that his own currency carried the seeds of his undoing. The goldsmith could never speak of what he was doing. He could never write it down. If caught, he would be tortured, not just for treason, but for humiliation. He had used the tools of empire to betray the empire itself, but still, he continued. Coin after coin, we do not know his name, but one of his creations was found, thousands of years later, during a dig in northern Mesopotamia. Archaeologists were puzzled. The coin was too light. Its edge. Strange. Upon close inspection, they discovered the faintest thread line. With careful work, they unscrewed it. Inside, a scrap of parchment, so old it crumbled at touch. Just one symbol remained, a mark from a rebel house long thought mythical. It confirmed the whispers. These weren't legends. They were tactics, and they weren't alone. Other hollow coins have been discovered since, some bronze, some gold. Most empty now, their messages long gone. But the craftsmanship remains. The message survives in the method. This wasn't espionage for kings. It was communication for the voiceless, a way for those crushed under conquest to speak, to move without sound, to plan without detection. The brilliance lies in its simplicity. A coin, trusted, weighty, valuable, became a vessel. No need for disguises, no need for hidden compartments in shoes or wax-sealed letters. Just currency, passed from hand to hand, with secrets coiled inside. And in this lies a deeper truth. Resistance doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears a merchant's robe. Sometimes it smells of metal and smoke. Sometimes it speaks not with slogans, but with screws. The goldsmith's coins remind us that even in the most oppressive systems, intelligence and defiance can find a way. That subversion doesn't need armies, just tools, just hands, just belief. So, the next time you hold a coin, imagine, what might be inside? What story? What risk? What hope? And remember, the empire may have the gold, but it's the rebel who makes it dangerous. The builders who tilted a statue in protest. In the heart of an ancient kingdom, within a temple now lost to time, a monument once stood, a statue carved in the likeness of a king, regal, towering, eternal. But it held a secret. To the priests and courtiers, it was a marvel, the perfect image of power, lit each morning by the golden rays of dawn. To the architects and masons, it was something else entirely, because the statue was flawed. Not in its craftsmanship, but in its position. It was tilted, just slightly, subtly, intentionally. Enough that each morning, as the sun rose behind the temple gates, the king's face cast a long shadow, not across the floor in majesty, but skewed across the wall, its jaw distorted, its crown misaligned, the silhouette twisted, as if mocking the very man it honored. It was, quite literally, a crooked image of a straight-faced king. For decades, no one noticed. Or, if they did, they said nothing. But archaeologists studying the ruins centuries later were puzzled. The statue, though elegant, was misaligned by just a few degrees, tilted westward. Too small to seem accidental, too precise to be a structural mistake. Then came the deeper analysis. The base beneath the sculpture had been subtly adjusted, chiseled in a way that appeared normal at first glance, but under modern scanning revealed calculated elevation on one side, just enough to shift the entire statue's axis. It had been done during construction, not later, not by time, by intent. And so, a theory emerged, one as poetic as it is chilling. The builders had done it on purpose. In a world where kings claimed to be gods, to challenge power openly was suicide. But stone could whisper. And shadows? Shadows could speak what mouths dared not. These were laborers, masons, craftsmen forced to carve the image of a ruler they may have hated. Perhaps their families starved while temples rose. Perhaps they were flogged for working too slowly. Perhaps they watched their wages vanish while royal statues multiplied. They could not rebel with fire, so they rebelled with geometry. A few degrees. That's all it took. A whisper in stone, a shift in light, and every morning, long after the builders had died, that statue would wake in shadow. not revered, but subtly ridiculed. A face meant to be immortalized instead became distorted by the sun itself, and no one could undo it, because to realign the statue would be to admit the flaw, to admit that power had been mocked, silently, endlessly. This wasn't the only act of silent protest in ancient construction. Across Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, even the Mayan world, there are signs. Misaligned eyes on statues, glyphs carved backwards, bricks with upside-down stamps. Subtle, deniable, but deliberate. Acts of resistance by those whose names were never carved into history, but whose fingerprints remain beneath its skin. Architecture is often viewed as a monument to glory, but look closely, and it becomes a confession. Because workers in the ancient world were not deaf to suffering. They were not blind to oppression, and some found a way to speak. Not with revolt, but with permanence, with stone, with sun, with shadow. The builders who tilted that statue didn't live to see the whispers understood, but they knew the sunrise would come, that light would bend, that the king's shadow would twist forever, and no priest, no emperor, no god could stop it. Their protest was slow, subtle, but immortal. So when we gaze at ancient temples today, marveling at symmetry and splendor, we should also look for what's slightly off. A statue that leans, a shadow that misbehaves, a line that breaks the pattern. Because those imperfections are not accidents, they are messages. Proof that even under tyranny, truth finds a way to survive. That even in the deepest silence, someone once said no, and set it in stone.